Welcome to Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston, PhD. Glenn has held his doctorate in psychology for more than 30 years and is also a former multi-million-dollar consultant to the big food industry and uses his experience to help you defeat your cravings. This show will help you to focus on dramatically reducing cravings and leave the diet mentality behind, so you can more easily and effortlessly achieve your health, fitness, and body composition goals. Please remember, no doctor-patient relationship is created via this show, and you are responsible for confirming any changes to your diet, health, or psychological routines with an appropriately licensed professional before implementing them. Now, before we get started, if you haven't yet downloaded the free smartphone app to access dozens of these recordings all in one place, as well as to avail yourself of a confidential community for support, motivation, and assistance, please visit the podcast link on defeatyourcravings.com as soon as possible. And now, here's your host, Dr. Glenn Livingston.
Hey, it's the very good Dr. Glenn Livingston with DefeatYourCravings.com. I'm here with Amy, the Master Coach, who has something she wants to talk about. And I said, sight unseen, let's just do it. So tell me, Amy, what is it?
So my topic for today, I'm going to call it Hunger as a Second Language. And I have to give you some of the backstory. And if it's not relevant, I guess you can always cut it out of the recording.
Tell me.
So many years ago, I can't even remember exactly when I first moved to Arizona, I was working for the state and they sent me to this conference, which was a methadone conference, which has nothing to do with this topic.
Just tell people what methadone is in case people don't know.
Oh, okay. Methadone, it's a medication used for some people as a substitute for opiate addiction or heroin addiction. They take it every day. It used to be, and still most places, you have to go to this little clinic and they dispense it, and then you may get weekend privileges. It's been replaced by a much better drug, but it still exists. And some people take it for pain management.
Okay, thank you.
Which is pretty much irrelevant to the topic, but it was a methadone conference, and there was a speaker there. I think he was I don't know what they're now called, Native American or indigenous person. And he was talking about how to do an interview because, this is going to be like patient or client oriented. And he said, when you're talking to a Native American, be sure that you wait long enough to listen for the answer. Because he said, us English speakers tend to lose our patience and not wait long enough. And then we'd ask a question, not wait for the answer, and then interrupt with another question. And to explain why we did this, he talked about different languages and different cultures have something called a pause time. Have you ever heard of this?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so you say something, then I say something, then you say something, and I say something. And depending on our culture or background, there's a variation in how long we expect to wait between the question and the answer or the statement or whatever.
That's so interesting.
So he was saying for Native American, they have a very long pause time. I don't remember what he said it was, but like 10 seconds. And so you have to honor that, and you just wait. And you sit there, and some of us, maybe the more extroverted ones of us, don't like the silence. But he said you sit through the silence and you wait until the person answers. And then to give an example of different cultures, he was talking about, well, okay, so let's say the Native American has a pause time of 10 seconds, and I'm going to make some of these up because I don't remember them all. But he said maybe people from the British Isles would have a pause time of 5 seconds, but people like Italians or Jews would have a pause time of -5.
Really?
Which means you interrupt each other all the time.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That's definitely true.
And if you're not interrupting each other, it means you're not really into the conversation. Whereas for other cultures, that's seen as really impolite and rude. And I've definitely had people that say to me, why do you keep interrupting me? And I'd say, well, why don't you get to the point of what you were saying? But that's off topic. Anyway, so there's pause times, which differ in different cultures. And then he went on to this, which is really more germane to what I wanted to talk about, English as a second language. And I guess this would be true for other languages, but since I'm an English speaker, I'll talk about English. So he said, everyone understands that if you learn English as a second language, your English is going to be different from a native speaker. So you might use idioms that you directly translate from your first language, your primary language. And so you're never going to sound exactly like a native English speaker. Maybe your accent's a little different, etc., right? Everyone gets that. But the part I didn't know and that I thought was really fascinating is if your parents came from a different country and then they learned English and then you learn English from them, your English is still going to be different from people who were native speakers.
Wait, say that again?
Okay, so let's say my parents come from another country and they move here and they learn English and then they have the child, me, and I learn English from them. My English is going to be different from a native speaker because I learned it from people who learned English as a second language.
Interesting. Of course, and that makes sense.
And then not only parents, but grandparents. So let's say my parents learned English from their parents who were immigrants. So their English was different. And then when I learn English from them, I don't sound like other people. It's, even applies to like regional accents. So in my case, my parents were born in New York and then moved to Fall River, Massachusetts. And so I learned English from people who learned English from people who learned to speak English with a New York accent. So my accent in Massachusetts didn't sound like everybody else. So my classmates always used to ask me, "Where are you from?" Because I learned English from people who learned English from people who were born in New York City or who actually were born in Hungary and Germany.
I believe that I'm with you. Okay.
Okay, you got that? So that set the stage for me to think about, what if you never experienced food insecurity or hunger because you grew up with enough food around you, your parents weren't in bankruptcy, or there was always food on the table, etc. But your parents or your grandparents grew up in poverty or food insecurity.
Like my grandparents in the Depression.
Like my grandparents and like my parents. And so, for example, let's say we had beef stew for dinner. My father would pull it off my plate, or he'd pull the serving dishes off the table and say, no, that's it, you've had enough, we're going to save the rest for leftovers. Because you never know, I guess he could run out of food at any time, even though there was no immediate danger of that. But that's how he was brought up.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
So even though there was plenty of food, I was brought up by someone who was always worried about food and would there be enough. Or if I didn't eat fast enough, he'd take the food off my plate. So I learned to eat with like my arm around the plate. I remember that he had this habit, which I've noticed I have now, that my mother hated. After he finished his meal, he would lick the plate, which she thought was like really uncouth. But I'm thinking now, he grew up with, you don't waste a single scrap of food, and maybe you're still a little hungry because you didn't get enough. And I know that happens to people who are chronic dieters as well. But some of it is sort of not just self-imposed, but part of this thing of, were you brought up by people who had insecurity around food, and that got transmitted to you, what I'm now calling hunger as a second language.
And so knowing that, how do you translate that to your own personal food recovery? Is it that it takes some of the shame away from it, it kind of normalizes it, or you understand that it didn't start with you? Tell me a little bit more about what you do with that insight. Why did this catch your attention? Why do you think it's so important?
Well, I know in your chapter 3, you talk about a lot of things about I can never say that word.
Organismic distress.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to practice. Organismic distress. And one of them is, are you eating enough?
For the benefit of the audience who haven't read the book, the concept of organismic distress is that just a sense that things really aren't okay. And when the brain has the perception that things aren't okay, it can fire their survival impulses, which make your rational thinking less pertinent and make the just hand over the cheesecake and nobody gets hurt kind of thinking more important. So that's why the concept of organismic distress is important. And we talk about, if you are the kind of person who sets out on a diet or sets up a rule for themselves, to eat healthier, on Monday morning, and then Monday afternoon, you think, oh, screw it, just do it. I just really want to. That's probably what's happening. There's probably some type of organismic distress occurring. And if you can start to prevent the distress from happening, then it's more likely you can stay in your rational brain and follow your rules. So go ahead, Amy.
Okay, so I'm thinking that if you were brought up like this, or if you have this sort of conditioning, then there's like always a low level, I can't think of the word I want, but anyway, ongoing, free floating hunger anxiety, feeling that I'm not going to get enough to eat, or, what if someone doesn't serve enough at dinner? Or I got invited one time to a guy's house who said, I only eat salad for dinner, although I put a lot of olive oil on it. And I was anxious the whole day thinking about, what the hell am I going to eat at this place? Salad, I'll be starving. Or I have a friend that I visit sometimes who serve you something and then immediately put it all away. And it kind of like awakens the same feeling I had. So it's helpful to recognize that. And people who are worried they're not going to get enough to eat, to remind yourself of the reality. If that is a reality, hopefully it's a reality, that you're not living in a food insecurity. There's plenty of food all around you, that if someone takes the food off your plate, you can now, as an adult, stand up for yourself and say, no, I wasn't finished yet. Or no, before you put that away, I would like a second serving. Or my biggest one, people want to share what's on my plate and I don't want to. And it's supposed to be polite. Oh, could I have a bite of that? I really don't want to give them a bite. And I guess it's because I figure my food is limited and I can't get more. And if I give them a taste, it's less for me. So, I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but it's helpful to be aware of.
We tend to look for all of the answers inside of ourselves. On a practical basis, I teach people to say feelings aren't facts. And just because you feel obligated to let this person take the plate away and save the leftovers doesn't mean that that's what you have to do. And so just that's on an existential level in the present moment as a rational adult, what your options are. But when you feel merged with your reptilian brain and it just feels like a very primitive response that you have to let that happen, I think that it could be very helpful to trace back where those feelings are coming from and to recognize that this probably didn't start with you. It might even go back several generations. I could relate this not to so much to food, but to my general sense of worry and catastrophizing. I've lived a very safe life, more or less. If you look at my actual level of financial security, if you look at my actual level of, shelter and having loved ones around me, and my life has been relatively safe. I was not drafted into the war. I didn't see combat. I was not raped or abused in that way. I was not scammed out of tons of money. I lived a relatively safe life. I mean, yes, there was a time I went deep into debt, but still, there were no men in white suits with mustaches coming to take away my house and kick me out on the street. There was never a possibility of that. I was always very far from that, even when I was $700,000 in debt, which thank God I am not in anymore. But nevertheless, whenever anything bad happens, I tend to catastrophize. For example, there's a downturn in the business and I think, well, I'm going to starve. It's almost beyond the realm of any possibility that I could starve. Yet I have that level of existential angst and organismic distress when something bad happens. And when I went back and I looked at my family history of the things that happened that could have led to that trauma kind of sitting inside of me, it was actually less what happened in my own family, more what happened in my great-grandparents' family. My great-grandmother was born in Tsarist Russia just before the revolution. And she married a wealthy man. He was a candy merchant, believe it or not, for all considering what happened to me. he sold candy. He was doing very, very well. He had a very wealthy business selling candy. And suddenly he was killed in a horse and buggy accident. And my grandmother had two sons, my grandfather and his brother. And the revolution happened and she didn't have enough money to get by over there. So she came to America. And when she got here, she didn't have enough money to manage two kids. So she put my grandfather in an orphanage. And so just think of the level of trauma for my grandfather. He lost his dad, he lost his way of life, and then he's stuck in an orphanage at, I think he was like 6 years old. And then he fell in with a bad crowd, got involved with some criminal activities and went to jail just before I was born. And my mother had no idea where he was, and she had always idolized him. There was all this incredible trauma. It wasn't really in my present day life. Like, I didn't know my grandfather before this happened. I only knew the guy after he got out of jail, and he was the best grandfather in the world. But the way that my mother reacted to trauma because of what happened to my grandfather, and like I had to sensitize myself to seeing when she was upset and how quickly she could become upset and really start panicking, I developed this tendency to catastrophize when bad things would happen. As if, oh my God, my life, I'm going to get plucked out of my life and placed in an orphanage, and the people that I love and who care for me are going to disappear. It's not true. When I knew that, when I realized where it was coming from, it suddenly didn't have quite the power that it used to over me. I still had to say very specifically why I was financially safe and not going to starve, and why the people I love were not going to abandon me. I still had to kind of do that logical refutation in order to feel sane again. But it took the mystery out of it. It took away the shame. There's a book called It Didn't Start With You. It made me realize that it didn't start with me, and kind of gave me permission to distance myself from it and just make more intellectual decisions about what I wanted to believe and what I wanted to tell myself, the story I wanted to tell myself when these things would happen. So it really did lead to a much higher level of adaptation. And I think that's what you're talking about, is you can go back and trace it back. It could help you to recognize that you're experiencing hunger as a second language, and you could interpret to yourself that it's really not an emergency and the danger doesn't exist in the present. So that's my best take on what you're saying. What do you think?
Well, some of it, even without going and looking at your ancestors' history, some of it could just be, how did your parents treat you around food? And to speculate, what must their upbringing have been like for them to do that?
Yeah, like my dad didn't like to share food. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because he wound up in a house with a bunch of stepkids and he was not really liked there. So I imagine he had to fight for his meals. I'm just guessing. That's probably part of it.
Well, it's funny. I can share food somewhat, but not desserts. So like, you go to a restaurant and say, well, I'm going to have XYZ dessert. And then someone says, I don't want any. I'll just have a bite of yours. I get really furious.
I'll try to remember that. Well, thanks, Amy. So the lesson that everybody should take away from this is Amy doesn't share dessert.
Yeah, if you want a bite, get your own, or I'll buy you your own piece. You can leave the rest on your plate as an exercise in self-restraint.
Did you ever see the Friends episode where Joey said Joey doesn't share food?
No.
Oh, you should look that up on YouTube. It's really funny.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Amy.
And that brings us to the end of today's broadcast of Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston. Now, if you'd like to find out more about the products and services Dr. Glenn offers to help you dramatically reduce your cravings and stop overeating in 90 days or less, please visit defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. That's defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. Thanks.